Hello, I'm Eric Wagoner with the West Virginia Humanities Council, and welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through first-person portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to both nonprofit and for-profit organizations across West Virginia. History Alive is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. They're entertaining and educational. We encourage your organization, school, or event to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Harriet Tubman or Stonewall Jackson come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures. Nothing compares to the live in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. Our History Alive presenters have researched a variety of sources, such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Alive presentation is not a play. It is an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Alive presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we will change the format a bit and have our guests sit with me for a few minutes after the monologue. But we hope to give a sample of how a History Alive presentation can add to your program offerings. There will be information on the screen at the end of this program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Alive character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio, Charles Schulz.
Hello, my name is Charles Schulz, though you may know me better for some of my characters that I've created, Charlie Brown, Snoopy. For 50 years, I drew the Peanuts comic strip, and they were all my ideas. It was all my artwork. Everything in it except the name, Peanuts. That was the syndicate's idea. In fact, after the strip had some success, I pleaded with them that we should change the name. Good old Charlie Brown. That's a good name for a comic strip, but well, that's all part of it, isn't it? These compromises. You see, my art, it isn't a pure art in the way that, say, Andrew Wyeth's is. Cartooning is a fairly sort of proposition. You have to be fairly intelligent. If you were really intelligent, you'd go do something else. You have to draw fairly well. If you drew really well, you'd be a painter. And you have to write fairly well. If you wrote really well, you'd write novels. So it's a great profession for a fairly sort of person, like me. And I think being fairly is a fine thing to be. If you were to look at my life growing up, there's nothing very remarkable about it. I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, November 20th, 1922, but I was raised in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm the son of a barber and a homemaker and an only child. My parents named me Charles Monroe Schulz. And it's a good, strong name that pretty much nobody in my life ever called me. When I was just a baby, an uncle came by to visit, and he picked me up, and something about me reminded him of the horse Sparkplug in the old comic strip Barney Google. And so he called me Sparky. And the name stuck. I suppose in a way there a connection between myself and the comics was made. Growing up, our life revolved around my father's barbershop, and every day after school I would run home and I would go to his barbershop and I would sit in one of the barber chairs and I would listen to him talk to the customers, or we would read the comics out loud together. That was our one indulgence, was we would get all 3 comics available and all 3 newspapers available. We'd sit and we'd pore over the different comics together. I once wrote in a strip where Charlie Brown, whose father is also a barber, Linus says to him, "Barbers must be very wealthy because once they've paid off the scissors, the rest is pure profit." But in truth, money was tight growing up, though I never really understood that. If we had pancakes a few nights in a week for dinner, I just assumed my parents knew how much I loved pancakes. My first recollection of being noticed as an artist came in kindergarten. I think it was the first day of school. Our teacher passed around these big white sheets of paper and black crayons and told us to draw whatever we wanted. And so I drew a man shoveling snow against a palm tree. And she came around and she picked it up and she held it up for the whole class to see, and she said, "Someday, Charles, you're going to be an artist." Now, she didn't have it quite right. She didn't say cartoonist, but I like to think there was a sign there of what was to come. My scholastic career got off to a good start when in second grade I was named the most outstanding boy student. Then I was moved ahead in third grade and fifth grade until suddenly I became the smallest kid in the whole class. When I got to middle school, I failed everything in sight. In high school, it wasn't much better. I am almost certain that to this day, I was the worst physics student in the history of St. Paul Central High School. But I kept drawing the whole way through, and in high school, I had my work published for the first time. A picture I'd drawn of our family dog, Spike, a precocious little black and white dog who would eat everything he could find. He would eat tacks off the floor, and so I drew a picture of Spike, and I wrote, "Spike eats tacks." And my father took it and he mailed it off to Ripley's Believe It or Not. And they published it. My parents, seeing some promise there, helped me to enroll in a program with federal schools, which would later become Art Instructions, Inc. It was a program just for cartoonists. And I did that through the end of high school and for a short while after, until with the Second World War, I was drafted. My mother was very ill then with cancer. But I had to go all the same, and she passed away while I was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The Army taught me everything I needed to know about loneliness. It was tough for a kid who'd never been away from home before, but my drawing helped me. It seemed that everybody in the camp with me needed somebody to draw Popeye on a letter home, and so I started to make friends that way. And I found that I was a pretty good soldier, too. I rose to the rank of Staff Sergeant of a 50 caliber machine gun squadron, the 20th Armored Division. We were deployed to Germany, and my division participated in the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp, and I myself was awarded the Combat Infantryman Badge. After the war, I came home. Like everybody else, we started looking for work. I was hired on by Timeless Topics, a religious publication, to do the lettering on some of their stuff, and I was hired by my alma mater, Art Instructions, Inc., to become an instructor for them. For a while, it was just my dad and I living in the apartment above the barber shop and working at Art Instructions, Inc. Those were some of the best days of my life. I became great friends with some fellow artists, Linus and Frida, and I started drawing these funny little kids with great big round heads, and I asked one of my coworkers if he wouldn't mind if I used his name for one of them, and he said, well, he wouldn't mind that at all. And I can remember perfectly well the first day that Charlie Brown came across the room to look down at my desk, and he saw this character which I named for him, and he said, "Is that what he looks like?" But they were wonderful times. I was improving my ability to draw and to present my ideas clearly, and I was sending work out all the time to newspapers, to syndicates, hoping something would sell, and eventually something did. Now, back in those days, if you sent something off to a newspaper or a syndicate, you couldn't just send copies. You oftentimes had to send originals, and when I did, I would include in envelopes. They could send the work back to me. Well, one day I received a letter from the Saturday Evening Post, and it said, "Look this week for boy in chair." Well, I'd sent them a picture of the little boy sitting at the end of a long chaise lounge, and he had pulled a footstool up to prop his feet up on. It was just a little sight gag, and I read the note and I thought, oh good. They didn't like it, but at least I'll get my artwork back. It wasn't until I was having dinner with my father that evening that it occurred to me. I said, "You don't think they were going to publish that, do you?" And sure enough, the next week there it was. I eventually sold 15 comics to the Saturday Evening Post and had a short-lived panel featured in the St. Paul Pioneer Press. I called it Sparky's Little Folks. It featured those funny little round-headed kids that I've been drawing, including my Charlie Brown character and his dog. And for 3 years, it ran in the women's section of their newspaper. I was paid $10 per comic. But I saw it I saw it becoming something bigger, something more. And so I marched down to the editor's office and I demanded two things. He was going to move my comic to the comics pages where it belonged, and I was going to get a raise. He turned me down flat. So I took my work back home and I began to rework it. Instead of a single panel, it would become a 4-panel strip. When I was satisfied with it, I had decided that rather than mail it somewhere, I was going to deliver it myself to New York City and United Features Syndicate. So I bought a train ticket, I went to New York, I stayed in a hotel there for the first time, and the next morning I got up so early that when I arrived at United Features offices on 42nd Street, the only other person there was the switchboard operator. But she was very nice, and she said I could leave my portfolio there and suggested that I go find some breakfast. So I did. I went and found a little diner, and by the time I came back, they had decided to buy the strip. They loved the artwork, they loved the writing. The only thing they weren't sure about was the name. Sparky's Lil Folks. You see, Lil Abner was already a popular strip at the time, and they were worried that the Lil might confuse things. Plus, there had already been a strip called Little Folks, which might further confuse things. I said, how about good old Charlie Brown? But they wanted something that reflected the ensemble nature of my strip. Somebody suggested Peanuts. I was 27, and they were a major syndicate ready to introduce my work to the world. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, and I took it, and I'm forever grateful for that opportunity, but Peanuts is still a terrible name. Nevertheless, on October 2nd, 1950, the first Peanuts cartoon appeared in a whopping 7 newspapers. But I had made it. I was a cartoonist, and with a newfound success, I ran home to Minnesota, and there was a certain red-haired girl who I had been dating named Donna, and I went to her and I said, Donna, will you marry me? And when she said no, because she wanted to marry somebody else instead, there was no doubt that Charlie Brown was on his way. Losers get started early.
We are back and very fortunate to be in the studio with cartoonist Charles Schulz. Mr. Schulz, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's a fascinating story. You know, those of us who are fans of the strip know it obviously as one of the longest running and most beloved American comic strips in history, but it's fascinating to hear from what humble beginnings the strip came. We don't often think about that. As you look back over the entirety of the career, this, you know, such a decades of history with this strip, what would you say are one or two of the major ways in which the strip changed over the course of the years throughout its life?
Oh, certainly. I would say probably the biggest change would be with the dog. Snoopy, at times, he became just so much larger than life in many ways. He started really as just a dog. He was walking around on 4 legs. The audience could always identify with him as just somebody's pet. He knew what the children were saying, but the audience didn't know what Snoopy was thinking. As Snoopy crawled up on his doghouse, as he first started to play ice hockey, he really allowed me to expand my imagination with the strip and to take it into some new places, which I thought were a lot of fun.
Yeah, and one of the most iconic characters, certainly from a very iconic strip. What do you think it is about Snoopy that made him, over the course of the years, such a core character, such a recognizable character who was so deeply associated with this strip?
He's just such a wonderfully fun character to draw and to experience things with. He doesn't have the limitations or the hang-ups of, say, a Charlie Brown.
The hang-ups is really interesting because one of the things that I know from reading over the strip from its earliest stages is that something I think a lot of people don't necessarily associate with the strip is in its earliest stages it was, I won't say dark, but it did, let's say, acknowledge the sort of more nervous side of childhood, the insecure side of childhood. Was it a fair statement, do you think?
I think so, yes. Yes, Charlie Brown, as it began, it was perhaps a bit more cynical of a character. As time went on, he, I would say, began to envelop more of my own personality. People oftentimes ask me if Charlie Brown is me, and in part he is. I say about 60% I'm Charlie Brown. But really all the characters represent different parts of my personality, and so I would say as I continue to develop as a person, my strip continued to develop with me.
To that point, one of the things, certainly from my generation, that we most associate with the strip is, of course, the television specials. When the cartoon was adapted for television specials, some seasonal, others having to do with specific storylines. As the strip developed into animated specials with children doing voiceover, and so it sort of took on a new life. Could you speak a little bit about how that process came to be?
Oh, certainly, yes. I've been asked about a lot of the different components of Peanuts as it became cartoons, as it became plushie dolls and all sorts of things. And I've always said I'm just a cartoonist. I just draw cartoons. There are wonderfully talented people who I work with who help me to do these different things. The television, the first special that we did, Charlie Brown Christmas, Lee Mendelsohn came to me about that. He and I had worked together years prior on a Willie Mays documentary, and so he approached me about putting together a special working with Bill Mendelsohn. And Bill and I had done some work together on some car commercials that featured the Peanuts gang. So we came together to create this story, and it was derived from existing strips. So we were going to storyboard based on some of these strips that I had drawn and some themes that had developed throughout the Peanuts comic strip. When we went to put it on television, it was an incredibly tight timeline. We had 6 months to produce that, which back in 1965 was a pretty tough thing to do. But in the end, we're very proud of the product that we created and of how it connected with the audiences. I was very involved early on in the films as there began to be many, many more of the animated features. I, of course, had to delegate that a bit more, but the strip was always my primary focus.
Got it. Looking back, were you surprised at, I guess, the magnitude of the cultural impact that the comic strip eventually developed over the course of its life?
Oh, yes. I had hoped that someday I might make a living to be a cartoonist. I never expected 250 million readers. That was surprising. It's hard to know just what's going to connect with audiences. When you write for them, you have to be honest with yourself about what you want to create, but certainly there's no way to plan for as big as Peanuts became, but it's been a wonderful surprise.
I know I'm asking you to speculate, but do you have any idea what it was about these characters that resonated so well with readers of all ages?
I think Charlie Brown's status as the everyman really helped him to connect with a lot of different people. I always put funny first in the comics, and I've been asked many times why Charlie Brown can't kick the football. And the answer is because kicking a football isn't funny, missing a football is. So as much as I love my characters, I was willing to let them go through those hard times for laughter, and I think some ways watching them struggle through different points of their life helped people to connect with them.
From an insider standpoint, as the creator, of course we know Snoopy, we know Charlie Brown. As we've discussed, there was a host of other characters, just a huge ensemble. Do you have any sense of who would you call the most, in his or her own particular way, who would you think was the most unique character out of that whole ensemble? Maybe not the most famous or the most widely recognized, but perhaps the most interesting from an insider standpoint.
Woodstock helped. He was somebody who could suddenly exist in Snoopy's world, who could go on all the adventures alongside Snoopy. He took me perhaps the longest to develop, from the time that I first introduced Woodstock to what he ended up looking like. He changed quite a bit, but he was a fun one to kind of to enter into the world. I liked him. Pigpen I thought was funny. Pigpen didn't appear very much. For his popularity, he's really not in very many comic strips, but people seem to love Pigpen.
One of the things I remember best about Woodstock is, of course, in his dialogue boxes with little hash strokes. The animals and the characters and Snoopy, they all spoke to one another, interacted with one another, but they each had their own unique method of phraseology, the ways in which they were represented through thought or through sound. Now, of course, when it came to the animated specials, obviously one of the most memorable portions of that transition is the teaching voice, speaking voice of the teacher. Could you speak a little bit about how that trombone sound came to develop?
Yes, well, in producing the first animated feature, Bill and Lee were both jazz fans. I'm a classical man myself. I love Brahms is my favorite, although, of course, Schroeder is a big Beethoven fan. That's only because Beethoven sounds funnier. But when we produced the special, they brought in the Vince Guaraldi Trio to do some of the music for that, and the sound fit with the show. And we were trying to solve the problem of the adults never being seen on screen in the Peanuts comic strip. How can they speak as they do in the strip without being actually heard by the audience, only by the children? So they brought in the trombone player from the trio, and he played a little bit for us, and we heard him, and I said, that'll work. So it wasn't so much my idea as much as the solution to a neat little problem.
Gotcha. I think every kid recognizes immediately what that horn sounds like, and coming from the teacher's desk. We've all heard it. Well, in the few moments that we have left, Mr. Schulz, thank you for joining us and being with us here today. I'd like to turn, if we may, to James Frummel, the man who portrays Charles Schulz in these History Alive programs. You are indeed from northern New Jersey.
I am, yes. I'm from the same town where Friday the 13th was filmed.
Is that
our
right?
claim to fame, yes.
It's a little trivia detail.
Yes.
But have been a West Virginia transplant now for many years. Actually attended WVU. Is that correct?
I did. I came to West Virginia to study in 2002. I graduated in 2006 and have been around the state pretty much ever since.
And you're on staff, is that correct, at the WVU School of Performing Arts?
Yeah, the College of Creative Arts.
College
Yes,
of Creative Arts.
I work with incoming students there, so I get to work with young artists, thespians, musicians as they get ready to pursue their college career.
Right. Very nice. As a working actor, I'm sure this particular type of project presents unique challenges, elements of preparation that might be specific to these performances. As a professional actor, how do you prepare for a History Alive program about Charles Schulz in a way that's unique to that venue?
I would say there's less creative research. If you're working with a fiction piece, oftentimes you're thinking about a character from a fictional background, so you're still wanting to have a background for that character, but it can really be, to a point, kind of whatever you want it to be. When you're presenting a real character, having the research kind of in your back pocket so that if you get that question about, what was his favorite sport, what were his cardio activities when he was old, all these little things which are kind of make up the man, getting to know all that. So not just researching to the point of writing the monologue portion, but knowing kind of all these tangential things about not just Peanuts, but also learning more about kind of the comics industry in general. This is, as a visual medium that, it was it at the time. I mean, television is just starting to come out as Peanuts does. It's just starting to kind of to get its legs. But up until that point, for Schulz growing up, it's all about the visuals of the comics. That's what everybody's going to congregate around. That's what everybody's going to know the stories of. So how that would have influenced his respect for this medium and his interest in participating in it.
What sources did you go to develop the monologue for these performances?
Luckily, Schulz wrote a lot. So he was, of course, a wonderful comic strip writer. He was, autodidactic. He read and wrote throughout his life. He, as I mentioned in a portion of the monologue there, he only went through high school. He never attended college formally beyond just some kind of community college classes for enrichment. So he was always interested in learning and letting people know what he had learned. So you find a lot of references to the scripture in his writing. That's things that he wrote a lot about. He taught scripture through a Bible study course. But the books, there's My Life with Charlie Brown, which is a collection of just his essays. There is an entire book of interviews that people conducted with Charlie Brown over 50 years of this comic strip, so how his perspective on things changes, why he made changes to the comic strip. He talks about everything. He was a wonderful artist and also just a really remarkable person in how he made himself available, not just kind of more broadly through these interviews, but to young artists. There's a lot of stories about comic strip artists working today who wrote to Charles Schulz and got a handwritten letter or typed letter back from him. Just a few weeks ago, it was in the news, somebody discovered a a letter they'd received from Charles Schulz. They wrote him a question about politics, and he wrote back to them and took the time to do that. So I think that's something that makes him really special. Is he participated in the development of new artists in different ways too.
Yeah, sounds like a real mentor
Yes.
for a lot of those. Right. Is there? We have just a minute or so left, but in the time we have left, is there anything? It was so fascinating to hear the stories about the nickname Sparky and about the little red-haired girl where it came from. Was there any one little piece of data that surprised you in your research about Schulz? Something that was the general public might not be too aware of?
The one fact that it took me a couple days to kind of process it was, and to my knowledge it's true, I've not found anything to the contrary, but they've said that Charlie Brown is the longest story told by one author about one character ever. And that is just such a neat thing that not only is he, he's iconic, he's a cartoon character, he's all these, or animated character rather, and all these different things, but he is also the character with whom we've had the most constant connection for the longest.
Yeah, true enough, and in so many different media too. The print, the comic strip, the films, and the television programs, even down to the iconography on plush dolls, as you said. It just absolutely permeates the culture. In the last minute or so that we have, Charles Schulz has really become one of our most popular History Alive characters. Any sense of why that might be? There's no real direct connection to West Virginia, but people just seem to love him when he shows up.
Well, I think there's just such a connection for all ages. So for some, it's remembering growing up with Peanuts, and for some, they're still growing up with Peanuts. So everybody has that connection to Charlie Brown, and most have fond memories, whether it's watching the animated specials, gathering around the newspaper, passing around the comic section, whatever it may be. People will just connect to the material.
There's a real longevity to it. Yeah, absolutely. James Frummel, thank you so much for joining us, and to Mr. Schulz, Sparky, thanks so much for making the trip and joining us here in time today.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Please join us next time.